Hello, everyone. This is Steve. Here in the United States. I'm going to be joined by our good colleague, brother here, Brother Weisfeld, here on Here and Now. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm here, all right. I'm right here in Quebec. Quebec is an autonomous region of Canada, which has won certain rights, national rights of identity, language rights, economic rights, like healthcare is under the control of Quebec here. And daycare was first initiated here as a public, resource, all that sort of stuff, which spread out to the rest of Canada. I'm I came here from Toronto actually, to study at the university called the University de Quebec à Montréal, which is the most revolutionary university I think in North America. And that's where I met up with some professors who allowed me to do my doctoral thesis, which explains in terms of political philosophy the difference between nationalism and national identity. We are national identity. The Black nation is a national identity. The Jewish people is a national identity. Zionism is nationalism. That's the difference. And I explain that in my thesis and then some books afterwards as well. And what is uh, the proposal here for the coexistence of two nations in the same country, both the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis, is a federation, not a confederation like the United States, which is an amalgam of states, but a federation in which people are united by their coexistence with their own proper autonomy. And that is, national autonomy. And in the Jewish Bund political theory, which was founded to defend the Jewish people and which was anti Zionist and didn't ask the Jewish people to run away from the fascists, but to turn around and to fight back the fascists and to defeat them. And we did. Well, that's what we call national cultural autonomy, Antifa, in other words. National cultural autonomy means that each nation gets to control their own culture, their own institutions, and they don't interfere with the institutions of the other nation. Okay, and that's coexistence. That's the only way to go. The nation state concept of 1648 that was invented by Hegel as a good Prussian, Prussian nationalism, and all that, which spread throughout history and caused so much misery, a number of wars in Europe, plus the Holocaust in Namibia. All of that comes from Hegel and a nation state concept. And we're dumping that. So that's what I am. That's what I'm about. And that's why I'm here with Steve. And we've got, a lot to talk to you about because we're pulling together a coherent mode of thought that can analyze and cope with the current crises. And there are so many of them. Now, the first thing that I wanted to mention, which is not mentioned, in the corporate media and not even on social media, is what is happening in Gaza. Every day 100 people are being killed, who are coming to pick up a bag of flour. Now, what is that all about? They call themselves, the U.S. aid agency calls itself something or other, humanitarian agency, Gaza humanitarian agency or something or other, Well, like that came about, as a result of what China was doing in May when they were parachuting in provisions en masse. And so they couldn't, let the people in the United States know that, China's helping out Gazan people to avoid starvation, whereas the United States and the Zionist regime were doing nothing. So they eventually had to sort of concede that they had to allow food into Gaza, but under controlled measure. And what does this control mean? So they force people to line up between two cages. Okay, there's about 4 rows. And, the Palestinians are forced to sort of line up in all these rows. And then they have to exchange their personal biometric data for a bag of flour. What is the purpose of this biometric, personal information? They get their name, they get their facial recognition, and they get, probably, their eye scans, the iris scans, so they can be each identified on an individual basis. Why? Well, then they hand this over information to, Egypt or some other country that is willing to take the Palestinians in as refugees, and they give them a list of names, and they say these people you can take in, and all those. And then they announce to all the people who have been registered, you can save yourself by going to this other country. Now get out. Why? Why do they want that territory so much? Before there were wars, assaults on Gaza, massacres, one after the other, killing a couple of thousand Palestinians at a time for, bombardments that lasted a couple of weeks. And then they were told, to get out by something or other, like the United States, posturing to make itself look good and making itself look like it's telling the Zionist regime, to be humanitarian and all that, because they are so humanitarian themselves. Well, this time that didn't happen. Why? Well, they discovered gas offshore of Gaza, under the Mediterranean Sea, 1.3 trillion cubic meters of gas worth $500 billion at today's rates. And they want it, they want it for themselves. It's not a Riviera that they want to build there. They want to build gas, liquefaction, refineries in order to sell the oil, sell the gas, to the world. Huh? That's what's happening. But the media is not talking about this. Even the social media is not talking about this. And that's a great lack of attention. And I don't know why they don't sort of, figure it out. It's sort of obvious. Okay. There's this other project, of course, the Ben Gurion Canal that they want to build as a competition, to the Suez Canal that'll go through Gaza to the Mediterranean from the Red Sea. And what's going to pay for that? The $500 billion, of course, like it's all connected. Okay. That's the first point that I have to make. Second point. In Vienna this past week, there was a conference called the Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress, and they call it the first Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress, which is a lie. Not out of intent, but out of ignorance, because the first Jewish anti-Zionist conference was in Toronto in 1981, and I organized it. And that brought in Rabbi Berger from the United States, who was from the Reform denomination, and he was the leading sort of, Jewish religious spokesperson against Zionism, because the Reform congregations began as a assimilationist, tendency in which they said that Jewish Americans were Americans and nobody was going to say that they aren't Americans type thing. And they were, rejecting Zionism because they didn't want to leave America. They're Americans, that type of thing. A shallow anti-Zionism, except that Rabbi Berger, made it a much more profound conviction. And then there was Israel Shahak from Palestine itself, and he was the leading academic historian who was exposing the Nakba of 1948. And he also did translations of a lot of Hebrew political documentation that showed how racist and genocidal they were. And then there was also Saigonik, who was a leading Canadian Marxist, the editor of the Canadian Dimension magazine, which was, the leading, leftist, magazine of Canada. And it was independent. It was independent of the Communist Party, independent of the Trotskyists. And it was, very well respected. But nobody knew that Saigonik was Jewish, including me, until, he came out, to be Jewish at the conference. And then I spoke as well. And my speech, is up on academia.edu. That was the first Congress that took place of anti-Zionist Jewish movement. Then in 2001, there was a conference in Chicago called the Jewish Unity for Just Peace. And there the slogan, Not in Our Name, was developed. And we formed a unity in action movement of both North and South America that didn't make a distinction between the proponents of a two-state solution and a one-state solution, because, that wasn't the issue at the time. The issue was, to stop the military assault on the Palestinian people everywhere, and also to defend the Palestinian refugees. Now, this group of leftists who called themselves previously the One State Group, composed of ex-CPers and others, who came to the same conclusion of a one state, decided they were going to call themselves something else, something, more fancy. And they called themselves the First International Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress, which it wasn't. So you come together and, they're for the purpose of endorsing the concept of a one state solution, which is not a solution, like one state, as if, that's the most democratic form of existence. Really? Okay, so how are you supposed to decide anything, if you have an evenly split population between the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis in the same territorial entity? It just doesn't work. It'd be an impasse. For instance, if the first motion to come before such a assembly were the right of return of the Palestinian refugees who are living outside of Palestine in great numbers, like 5 to 8 million, who were kicked out in 1948, had children, etc. Okay, what about them? Do they not have a right of return? Of course they do. To their own country? Of course they do. So they don't take that into consideration at all. So it's not a solution. It's not a solution for the Palestinians. It's only a solution for some Palestinians who will have somewhat better rights, in such a formation. And they consider it, to be the first step towards an eventual solution. Well, that's called reformism, and reformism doesn't work, because it doesn't address any solution. It only addresses certain immediate grievances, as if, the existing power would remain in power, and that cannot be allowed, because that's a Zionist state, and a state itself is a reactionary form, and a Zionist state is a doubly reactionary form. It is an apartheid state, one, against the Palestinians, also against the Mizrahim, who are Arab Jewish people, who comprise not 10%, not 20% of the population, not 30%, but 50% of the Jewish Israeli population are Jewish Arabs, with brown skin. And then they're sent off, to peripheral sort of settlements, to guard the frontier with guns. Okay. Then there's the Ethiopians, black Jewish Israelis, who are a third layer of apartheid. And then there's the Druze, who are Israeli Arab population who are given sort of a favored status. And in reciprocity, they actually join the military and they go into the military and kill people. Like my friend Tom Hurdle from the International Solidarity Movement, who I met in Balata refugee camp in 2003 when we went there to volunteer after Rochelle Corey was killed, crushed by a bulldozer in Rafah, Gaza. He went down to Rafah afterwards and he was shot in the head by a Druze soldier. That's what the Druze are. Now the Druze are fighting against with the Bedouin, in southern Syria, where a lot of the Druze there are sympathetic, to the Zionist state because they figure they're going to get support from the Zionist state. And they did. The Bedouin were being bombed, by Israel, and then the government in Damascus had to come in and stop the Zionists, from bombing the Bedouin, and they went in there and they as a peace keeping force, and they stopped the fighting between the two sectarian communities there. Okay, that's the so-called First International Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress, in Vienna. And the third thing that I want to bring your attention to is the resistance happening in the United States of America. Inside the United States of America, there is resistance against the government of the United States of America, the federal government, the confederal government of the United States of America, with the president and his presidential decrees in violation of the law, in violation of any judicial authority. He sends the ICE, to kidnap people without a warrant. A warrant means, sort of an order signed by a judge. They don't have that. They don't have any sort of legal procedure to follow. They think they don't need it. Well, the judicial authority is going to overrule that and has in many instances. And I have the proof, in my Facebook page, that I'll get to later on, and I'll show you some of the details that have to bear upon these points to be made here and now. So, Steve, I think that those are some important points, that are lacking in the general discussion that is ongoing now, mostly here on social media. But I think that social media has become more important than corporate media. Corporate media is catching up to social media. And we have to uh, get out there, because we're not getting enough attention. I mean, there's the political activists and organizers, who will want to learn from what we have to say, in terms of the experience that we have to share with everyone. But it's not enough. We need to get more leeway here, and we continue to do so. So, do you have any sort of, have I missed anything?
Well, no, I just want to share something that happened last night, which I kind of think is important to show this, to show our relative status, not you and me, but the social movement that we are part of. There's a person I know of. I'm not associated with them, but they're called Syrian Girl Partisan, and they invited their followers on Instagram and social media to view a program coming from Australia yesterday about free speech in Australia. Uh, it was it was in many ways targeting the persecution of people in Australia who are critical of the Israeli project in any dimension, a dimension you and I might agree with or disagree with. And last night when I went to bed, I was looking at the live stream, a tape of the live stream from Australia. Well, guess what YouTube did this morning? They blocked access to the recording, saying it disagreed with their community guidelines. It's not even available. I want to finish watching it. It's gone, so nobody can even watch it.
Hmm.
That's what's it was. And I like Syrian Girl's presentation. She was showing how the Israeli state, through its allies um, in the Australian government and outside of Australia, have created institutions to combat anti-Semitism, quote unquote. And the anti-Semitism is basically following some international anti-Semitic guidelines.
Mm,
This and that, we've talked about these before. So
yeah.
I want people to know this is not well during the highlight of the 2023 campus movement. This type of conversation was pretty much singled out in Germany. Germany was the center of the anti anti Israeli Defense Force massacres of the Palestinian people, and Germany would not allow demonstrations. Germany was shutting it down, and that was a center, and it is now spread around the world. Um, this, as far as the United States goes, as we know, their last year on the campus was quite quiet. Even there were organizations, there were demonstrations, but the universities in the United States were a target of this movement to stop the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli violence against the Palestinian movement. It was somewhat effective. It wasn't totally effective, but it was somewhat effective. Then ICE came in, and ICE's first target was who? The people who were supporting Palestine. That was the first target. It wasn't the undocumented or the alleged undocumented.
Yes.
So it was the pro Palestinian movement was the first target. And many of the people, beside one or two people who I would say were activists focused, they were just selected because they wrote a letter to the editor opposing what Israel was doing. And they were locked up by ICE. All were released, but most have been very quiet afterwards. They didn't expect that, and they weren't even part of any movement. They were part of socially a social consciousness increase around the horrors of what the United States and the Israeli government does. So whenever you mention and also this will also just remind people a year and 3 months ago in Los Angeles, remember the students were protesting. A mob of pro-Zionist men from off campus came, attacked the demonstrators who were in their demonstrations, peacefully demonstrating, attacked them with violence, with fireworks, with all type of grenades, with law enforcement watching, and nothing was done. So we see an equivalence here between the movement to what I would say stop debate, to impinge debate, and to get people off the airway, off of the internet airwaves, and the movement to shut down immigrants and people who are in the United States who want to stay here and work. We see an equivalence, and ICE and YouTube are at this point one of the major methods that they're using to silence people. And it is concerning. Um, I wouldn't say they're winning, but they're not losing because that program from Australia is off of YouTube. It was live streamed yesterday and it's no longer available. It's gone. So they're practicing censorship as much as possible. And I think people should be aware of it and just keep in mind when we make like programs like this, we may have to put eventually other methods of distribution, other channels, other fora will have to be used because the powers that be are determined that what you talked about, the land underneath Palestine will be seized. They want that land seized. They support the Greater Israel Project as a vector for destroying the Middle East or the Levant as we currently know it.
Yeah, good point. We're dependent upon YouTube right now,
Right,
but that seems to be not as stable as it seemed before.
right. This was gone, Aaron. This is gone less than 12. I went to bed at maybe 1 a.m., 12 midnight. I wake up at 5:36. It's off. It's gone.
Wow.
Oh, I mean, it's good. It's not even there. It's been taken off because of community guidelines, and that's it. It's as if it's not only as if it never existed. We don't want you to hear it. That's the
Uh,
impression I got. We don't want you to hear it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. What about Facebook? What do you think about Facebook? Because
I don't
I
use it.
I have a very active, life on Facebook, and I don't get much harassment. Like maybe a couple of times I was suspended, for a day, a year or two ago, but nothing at all, since then. Maybe because I have an academic qualification, but nonetheless, I put out some pretty heavy stuff. But I make sure that if anything has any ambiguity to its content, I don't use it.
Right,
And in the two groups, that I moderate Jewish Not Zionist, which is like some 15,000 subscribers right now. The same thing, like nobody gets away with any ambiguous stuff. And on the group in France that I moderate, somehow I ended up being a second moderator of, this group in France, which has 145,000 subscribers. Okay, mostly Arabic people, and there's a lot of hate that is put forward, unfortunately. And there was even, some attacks against Jewish institutions that were not necessarily Zionist, even, in France, from a certain, like a locality. And when I was in Palestine, this was happening. And it was, being used, by the corporate media and by the Zionists, to discredit, the Palestinian solidarity movement. So, with a Hamas member who had just gotten out of prison, who was setting up a hostel, we made a video expressing our mutual respect and solidarity and sent that out on social media and to the group, in Europe there. And since then, there have been no attacks on Jewish institutions there. Hmm?
Good.
So that worked. Okay. So I have that, as well, and we get tremendous amount of material that's coming through there in French. I'm trilingual, actually, because I live here in Quebec now. I did my doctorate at the French University. Because languages to me, it's a very flexible thing. My first language is not even English. I only learned, to speak English at about from 5 to 8 years old, and learned how to write English, from 20 to 30 years old. Had a lot of trouble in the English school system. So, mathematics and physics, were my favorites rather than English. But there's a tremendous, like mobilization of public opinion, but we're not organized enough. Now we're starting to get organized, but some missteps, like are very disadvantageous, to the Palestinian resistance. To talk, to mouth off, about one state group as if that's the most radical thing you can say is not. It's not even examined. It's not, discussed. It's not considered, in any sort of detail. There's no program. There's no sort of, transitional sort of, process involved. No constitutional proposition. All that's necessary, but absent. No, that discussion has to be opened up. And that's what I'm doing, especially with a book, that was published in English, The Federation of Palestinian and Hebrew Nations, not Israeli. Israel is the name of the Jewish people. It's not the name of a state. That corrects that. And then subsequently, I did a critique of the genocidal tendencies in Judaism that's used by the Zionists. When they talk about Amalekites, and eradicating Amalekites and all that. That's like a signal to them and Netanyahu to go and commit genocide, with the support of the deity. That's what that word means. And so, I explained, how that was introduced into Judaism by the editor Ezra. And there's a big difference, between the original texts of the Torah, the Old Testament, which was in two versions prior to that time, which didn't contain a genocidal tendency in it. But that was introduced, and then embellished, as a Judeo-Christian doctrine to which Netanyahu adheres to, and he even uses the term Judeo-Christian because he's got a lot of supporters there, United States, from the Christian evangelical, pro-Zionist milieu, which in 1825 actually invented Zionism because they wanted to get rid of the Jewish people, send them off to Palestine to colonize it on behalf of whatever superpower there existed at the time, And that started off, that whole sort of, thing started off with Cromwell in England when he wanted to anglicize the British Jewish community and send them off to Palestine, colonize it, for the British Empire. And then along comes Napoleon, who wanted to send all the Jewish people in Morocco to Palestine, to colonize it on behalf of the French Empire. And they refused. So did the British Jewish population as well. And then along come the Nazis, with the Havre Agreement, in which they agreed with the Zionists, to send, the Zionist communities, to Palestine
Oh,
uh,
may I say
with
something real quick?
financial backing.
May I say something real quick? What,
And then
what, what,
Oh,
what
yes, we have less than 1 minute, because my renewal of my credit card, for paying for the subscription to Zoom has expired.
you just said is considered anti-Semitism right there.
Yeah, all those propositions are anti-Semitic, you know.
Exactly, and that's just a foolishness. Thank you, thank you for letting me say that. I'm sorry. That's